When the betrayal became undeniable, Mary Pickford moved to protect her empire, while Sylvia Ashley secured her financial future. Mary Pickford evicted Douglas Fairbanks from his own empire, leaving Sylvia Ashley to manage his fading ego and his remaining treasury. He died believing he was a conqueror, unaware of how meticulously his decline had been managed. Mary Pickford reacted to infidelity with auditing ledgers rather than tears. The America's Sweetheart marketing facade masked a ruthless negotiator and industrialist. The public image of Pickford in the 1910s and 1920s was that of an innocent, golden-curled girl, the perpetual adolescent who radiated purity and fragility on screen. This carefully manufactured persona generated millions of dollars, but it bore absolutely no resemblance to the woman operating behind the camera. Gladys Marie Smith, who adopted the stage name Mary Pickford, understood the mechanics of leverage better than the studio bosses who attempted to control her. Recognizing early that studios treated actors as disposable labor, she engaged in brutal contract renegotiations. By 1916, she forced Paramount to pay her a record-breaking $10,000 a week, plus a massive signing bonus and profit participation. But she despised being controlled. In 1919, allied with Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, and Douglas Fairbanks, she executed a massive structural rebellion by founding United Artists. They bypassed the studio cartel entirely, retaining total ownership of their films and controlling their own distribution. Richard Rowland, the head of Metro Pictures, famously summarized the shockwave this move sent through the corporate establishment, stating that the lunatics had taken over the asylum. When Fairbanks married Pickford in 1920, it was a corporate merger between two of the industry's highest-grossing assets. They constructed Pickfair, a 56-acre estate that operated as the geopolitical embassy of the American film industry. By hosting global royalty, ESC, scientific pioneers, and literary titans, Pickford and Fairbanks crowned themselves the absolute monarchs of Hollywood. However, a monarchy is only stable as long as both rulers retain their market value. In 1927, the transition to synchronized sound triggered an extinction-level event for silent film actors. For Douglas Fairbanks, the microphone was a fatal weapon. His brand relied on physical invincibility and exaggerated acrobatics, which appeared comical when paired with spoken dialogue. As he approached 50, his physical prowess eroded, and his box office returns plummeted. The psychological impact of this obsolescence on Fairbanks was catastrophic. Pickford survived the disruption because her power lay in the boardroom. She was a studio executive. Fairbanks's power was tied entirely to his fading physicality. He was reduced to a prince consort in a palace financed and managed by his wife. Terrified of his own irrelevance, he desperately needed a mechanism to restore his fractured ego. He needed a woman who was entirely dependent on him, someone who would look at him with the unconditional reverence that the ticket-buying public had abruptly withdrawn. This severe psychological deficit created the exact market conditions required for Sylvia Ashley to execute her strategy. Sylvia Ashley's tactical precision was forged in her origins. Born Edith Louisa Hawkes in 1904 into a working-class London family, she recognized early that in a patriarchal economy, female beauty was a tangible currency that could be traded for capital and status. She meticulously eradicated her working-class accent, adopted the polished cadence of the British upper class, and executed a massive upward wealth transfer by marrying Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper in 1927. Acquiring the title of Lady Ashley granted her an absolute passport into the highest echelons of international high society. However, she was highly pragmatic about the declining liquid capital of the British aristocracy. She aimed the marriage for its social utility while simultaneously positioning herself where the newly minted wealth of the American entertainment industry intersected with European elite. She operated with the cold efficiency of an independent wealth manager seeking the ultimate high-yield investment. Douglas Fairbanks's introduction to Sylvia Ashley occurred during a period of profound psychological and professional vulnerability. The advent of synchronized sound had ruthlessly exposed Fairbanks's limitations, initiating a steep decline in his box office viability and his standing within the executive hierarchy of United Artists. Fleeing the suffocating reality of his obsolescence in Hollywood, Fairbanks began to spend increasing amounts of time in Europe. He was attempting to outrun his own irrelevance. He arrived in London not as the conquering hero of the silent screen, but as an aging, deeply insecure man of 50, terrified of his fading virility and alienated from the corporate powerhouse his wife had become. He required urgent psychological stabilization. He needed a profound external validation of his masculinity and his status, a validation that the ticket-buying public and the Hollywood executives were rapidly withdrawing. Sylvia Ashley recognized his vulnerability. Meeting in the early 1930s, she provided the exact psychological validation the aging star was desperate for. She did not approach Fairbanks with the intimidating intellect of a corporate peer, nor did she approach him with the transparent greed of a lower-tier opportunist. She offered him the exact psychological narcotic he was starving for: absolute, uncritical adoration. Ashley understood the fragile ego of the aging male executive. She made it her primary occupation to reflect Fairbanks's desired self-image back to him. When he spoke of his past cinematic triumphs, she listened with rapt, worshipful attention. When he exhibited his remaining physical prowess, she applauded with the enthusiasm of a subject greeting her king. She carefully curated an environment around him where his insecurities were neutralized and his fading dominance was continuously reaffirmed. This was not a romance born of naive passion. It was a transactional alignment of needs. Fairbanks required a mirror that hid his wrinkles and amplified his mythology. Ashley required a billionaire with global mobility and massive liquid assets. She supplied the psychological infrastructure he lacked, and in exchange, he granted her access to the highest tiers of American cinematic wealth. Fairbanks fell into the dynamic with blinding speed. He believed he was the one initiating the conquest, the virile monarch taking a beautiful, titled European aristocrat as his prize. He paraded her through the elite circles of London and Paris, aggressively utilizing her youth and her title to signal to the world and to himself that he was still a man of supreme desirability and power. He was entirely oblivious to the reality that he was being managed. He was not the conqueror, he was the acquisition. As the affair intensified between 1933 and 1934, Fairbanks made a critical strategic error. He isolated himself. Believing he was constructing a private, romantic utopia free from the pressures of the Hollywood studio system and the intimidating shadow of Mary Pickford, he began to take Ashley on extended, highly publicized excursions. They spent months aboard luxury yachts, cruising the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the global outposts of the international elite. Aboard these yachts, Fairbanks was the undisputed king of a floating, localized kingdom. Surrounded by compliant staff and the relentless adoration of Sylvia Ashley, He successfully insulated himself from the harsh economic realities of Los Angeles. He did not have to look at the declining box office receipts. He did not have to sit in United Artists board meetings, where his input was increasingly marginalized. He did not have to face the cold, analyte-cow gaze of his wife. However, this self-imposed exile was a fatal miscalculation of his corporate position. While Fairbanks was sailing the Riviera, completely absorbed in the illusion of his renewed youth, he was actively vacating his seat of power. In the ruthless corporate ecosystem of Hollywood, absence does not make the heart grow fonder. Absence allows competitors and partners to consolidate authority. By removing himself from the daily operations of United Artists and the political maneuvering at Pickford, Fairbanks voluntarily relinquished his leverage. He assumed his status as a founding partner was immutable. He failed to recognize that in a capitalist enterprise, power is not granted by past achievements. It is maintained by constant active enforcement. Sylvia Ashley conversely utilized this isolation to solidify her indispensability. By removing Fairbanks from his established support networks, his business managers, his longtime friends, and most importantly, his wife, she became his sole confidant and primary source of emotional regulation. She made herself the absolute center of his daily existence. She was establishing a monopoly on his attention. Every month they spent at sea, Fairbanks grew more dependent on her, and his ties to his corporate base in California grew weaker. He was a king who had abandoned his capital, entirely unaware that the gates were being locked behind him. In the 1930s, the concept of privacy for individuals of Fairbanks and Pickford's magnitude was a structural impossibility. The Hollywood studio system was deeply intertwined with the international press syndicates, the transatlantic telegraph networks, and the global hospitality industry. A whisper in a dining room at the Savoy Hotel in London would reach a boardroom in Beverly Hills within hours. Mary Pickford did not need to hire private investigators to discover her husband's infidelity. The intelligence flowed to her through the highly efficient, heavily fortified network of studio executives, financial managers, and elite socialites who depended on the stability of the Pickford empire. She was informed of the Mediterranean yacht cruises, the lavish expenditures, and the public displays of affection with Lady Ashley almost in real time. For an ordinary spouse, this continuous stream of public humiliation would trigger an immediate emotional detonation. The standard protocol for a betrayed Hollywood wife involved tearful press conferences, leaked statements of heartbreak to sympathetic gossip columnists, and a chaotic public confrontation. Mary Pickford completely rejected this protocol. Upon confirming the extent of Fairbanks's betrayal, Pickford did not react with hysteria. She reacted with the chilling, detached calculation of a chief executive officer who has just been informed that a senior partner is embezzling funds and damaging the corporate brand. She understood that emotional outbursts were a surrender of power. To weep in front of the press was to admit defeat, to position oneself as a victim. Mary Pickford refused to be a victim. She was an industrialist, and she treated the situation as a critical crisis in brand management and asset protection. Her first directive was absolute public silence. She enforced a strict gag order on her personal staff, her publicists, and her legal representatives. When the press camped outside the gates of Pickford, demanding a statement on the rumors of Fairbanks's European affair, they were met with an impenetrable wall of silence. Pickford understood the economic value of information control. By refusing to confirm or deny the allegations, she deprived the tabloids of the oxygen they needed to turn the affair into a catastrophic scandal. She bought herself the most critical asset in any corporate dispute: time. Behind the closed doors of Pickford, however, Pickford initiated a comprehensive, ruthless audit of her marriage. She summoned her elite team of contract lawyers, wealth managers, and corporate accountants. The mandate was clear: quantify the financial and reputational exposure created by Douglas Fairbanks. The calculation was complex. Pickford and Fairbanks were not merely married. Their assets were deeply structurally entangled. They held joint ownership of the massive Pickford estate. They shared controlling stakes in United Artists. They were co-investors in vast tracts of Southern California real estate, tax-free municipal bonds, and international distribution rights. Pickford's team began to meticulously untangle this financial web. They assessed the exact market value of Fairbanks's shares. They calculated the potential depreciation of the United Artists brand if Fairbanks's public behavior escalated into a morality scandal. In the 1930s, the Hollywood studios were terrified of the newly established Production Code Administration and the Catholic Legion of Decency, organizations that could organize massive nationwide boycotts of films featuring actors involved in public immorality. Pickford realized that Fairbanks's reckless affair with a married British aristocrat was not just a personal insult. It was a massive liability that threatened the revenue streams of their entire corporation. Pickford sat at the head of the conference table reviewing the ledgers. She evaluated Fairbanks the way a hedge fund manager evaluates a distressed asset. He was no longer generating significant box office revenue. His physical decline was irreversible. His current actions were highly erratic and legally dangerous. The return on investment had plummeted into the negative, while the risk profile had skyrocketed. The emotional bond of the marriage was cleanly severed and compartmentalized. Pickford reached the only logical conclusion a capitalist could reach. The partnership had to be dissolved, the liability had to be liquidated, and the core assets had to be aggressively protected. She was going to execute a hostile takeover of her own marriage, and she was going to do it so clinically that Fairbanks would not realize he had been evicted until the locks were already changed. While Fairbanks and Ashley continued their highly visible chemically and ego-fueled progression across the European continent, Pickford remained in Los Angeles, finalizing the architecture of her response. She recognized that the standard legal mechanisms of a California divorce, which generally dictated an equal division of community property, were insufficient for her objectives. She did not want to split the empire. She wanted to retain absolute control over its vital organs, specifically Pickford and her voting power within United Artists. To achieve this, she required leverage. She began to quietly assemble a dossier of Fairbanks's financial expenditures during his affair. Every luxury suite booked in Paris, every piece of jewelry purchased for Sylvia Ashley, every charter fee for a Mediterranean yacht was documented and cross-referenced with their joint accounts. If Fairbanks attempted to challenge her in a highly publicized divorce trial, Pickford was preparing the ammunition to publicly expose his squandering of marital assets, an action that would shatter his remaining public goodwill and invite devastating financial penalties from a sympathetic judge. However, a public trial was the absolute last resort. Trials generated unpredictable variables and damaged corporate stability. Pickford's primary strategy was to construct a financial exit package so tightly structured and so legally intimidating that Fairbanks would have no choice but to accept a private, out-of-court settlement entirely on her terms. She was essentially calculating the exact price of his severance. She determined how much liquid capital she was willing to release to him in exchange for his full surrender of the strategic assets. She treated his infidelity not as a sin to be punished, but as a breach of contract that provided her with a legal justification to terminate the agreement and restructure the corporation. By the end of 1934, the board was set. Sylvia Ashley had successfully transformed Douglas Fairbanks from a reigning cinematic king into a dependent, isolated asset, extracting maximum financial and social utility from his desperate need for validation. Mary Pickford had successfully quantified the betrayal, insulated her corporate infrastructure, and prepared the legal mechanisms for a flawless, bloodless liquidation. Douglas Fairbanks, entirely ignorant of the massive financial and strategic forces moving against him, believed he was simply a man enjoying a late-in-life romance. He was about to return to Los Angeles, expecting to resume his position on the throne, completely unaware that his wife had already sold the castle, and his mistress was already calculating the yield on her investment. The collision between the illusion of male power and the cold, unyielding reality of female economic survival was imminent. When Douglas Fairbanks eventually returned to Los Angeles in the mid-1930s, following his highly publicized transatlantic excursions with Sylvia Ashley, he operated under a profound and ultimately fatal cognitive bias. He anticipated a confrontation, but he expected it to be conducted within the familiar, predictable parameters of a domestic dispute. He braced himself for tears, accusations, and a dramatic display of jealousy from Mary Pickford. In Fairbanks's calculation, an emotional explosion would validate his enduring desirability and grant him the opportunity to utilize his legendary charm, the very mechanism that had built his career, to negotiate a truce, or at least a manageable separation that preserved his status and his assets. He was entirely unprepared for the reality of the environment he walked into. Upon his arrival, Fairbanks was met not with a weeping wife, but with an impenetrable corporate firewall. Mary Pickford refused to grant him an emotional audience. She recognized that engaging in a screaming match or a tearful negotiation was a tactical error. It would lower her from the position of an injured majority shareholder to that of a discarded spouse. Pickford stripped the situation of all domestic intimacy. When Fairbanks attempted to communicate, he was directed to her legal representatives. This denial of emotional arbitration was the first devastating psychological blow to Fairbanks. By refusing to show pain or jealousy, Pickford denied him the validation he desperately sought. She reduced his grand, scandalous affair with a British aristocrat to a mere contractual breach, a human resources issue that required administrative processing rather than passionate debate. Fairbanks, a man who required constant noise and dramatic conflict to feel alive, found himself suffocating in an absolute chilling silence. Pickford had successfully shifted the jurisdiction of their separation from the bedroom to the boardroom. She did not ask Fairbanks why he had betrayed her. Her attorney simply asked how he intended to structure his financial exit. This clinical detachment completely neutralized Fairbanks's primary weapons, his charisma and his ability to manipulate narrative through emotional appeal. He was a silent film actor, suddenly forced to negotiate in the unforgiving language of corporate finance, a language in which his wife was fluently, ruthlessly proficient. To execute the separation precisely on her terms, Pickford leveraged the formidable legal apparatus she had constructed over 2 decades in the film industry. The central complication of the Fairbanks-Pickford divorce was the sheer scale and profound entanglement of their wealth. In the 1930s, California's community property laws generally dictated a 50-50 division of assets acquired during a marriage. However, for executives of their magnitude, a standard court-ordered division was an unacceptable risk. It would require a public audit of their finances, exposing the internal accounting of United Artists, the valuations of their extensive real estate holdings, and the specific details of their investment portfolios to the press and their corporate competitors. Furthermore, a public divorce trial would necessitate the formal legal documentation of Fairbanks's adultery. While the tabloids thrived on rumors, a verified court record of moral turpitude could trigger the morals clauses embedded in their various distribution and endorsement contracts. Pickford understood that a messy public trial would not only humiliate Fairbanks, but would inflict catastrophic collateral financial damage on her own net worth and the United Artists brand. Therefore, Pickford's legal strategy was designed to achieve total capitulation through overwhelming private intimidation. Her attorneys presented Fairbanks's legal team with a meticulously compiled dossier. It was a comprehensive accounting of the financial exposure his erratic behavior had generated. They presented the ledgers documenting his extravagant spending in Europe with Sylvia Ashley, framing it not as infidelity, but as the reckless mismanagement and squandering of marital assets. The implied threat was absolute and terrifyingly clear. If Fairbanks attempted to contest Pickford's terms or demanded a public trial to fight for a larger share of the empire, she would unleash this dossier in open court. She would use her vast financial resources to drag him through a protracted legal war of attrition that he could not afford to sustain. She would publicly brand him as a financial liability, a move that would permanently alienate him from the studio executives who controlled whatever remained of his career prospects. Faced with the prospect of public financial ruin and the total exposure of his declining capital, Fairbanks's bravado collapsed. The reality of his socio-economic vulnerability, which Sylvia Ashley had so carefully masked during their yacht cruises, was brutally exposed under the fluorescent lights of the illegal negotiation. He possessed no leverage. He was an aging actor with declining revenue streams, facing a billionaire industrialist who held the absolute power to destroy his remaining institutional credibility. He instructed his lawyers to accept a private, negotiated settlement. He surrendered. Pickfair was not simply a piece of residential real estate, it was the crown jewel of their portfolio, the physical epicenter of Hollywood's social and political power structure. It was the fortress from which they had governed the industry. Pickford recognized that if Fairbanks retained ownership or even partial equity in Pickfair, he would retain a symbolic foothold in the power dynamics of Los Angeles. He could theoretically continue to host his own factions, utilizing the estate to legitimize his new life with Sylvia Ashley and project an illusion of enduring authority. Pickford determined that this outcome was unacceptable. To fully execute his severance from her empire, she had to physically and legally evict him from the capital. The negotiation for Pickfair was a masterclass in aggressive asset valuation and cold liquidity. Pickford did not demand the house out of sentimental attachment. She demanded it to consolidate her territorial dominance. She approached the acquisition exactly as a corporate entity approaches a hostile takeover. She had the estate rigorously appraised, stripping away its mythological value and reducing it to raw market figures. The value of the acreage, the square footage of the structures, the art collection, and the imported European antiques. Once the hard numerical value was established, Pickford utilized her greatest strategic advantage, cash liquidity. Throughout the 1920s, while Fairbanks spent lavishly on maintaining his physical image and funding his international excursions, Pickford had relentlessly diversified her income, investing heavily in tax-free municipal bonds, commercial real estate, and blue-chip stocks. She possessed a staggering amount of highly liquid, immediately accessible capital. She presented Fairbanks with a direct, non-negotiable offer. She would use her personal private funds to purchase his 50% equity stake in Pickford outright. This offer forced Fairbanks to confront a humiliating financial truth. Despite his decades as a global superstar, his actual liquid wealth was heavily depleted. His lifestyle with Sylvia Ashley, combined with the severe reduction in his box office earning power, had left him cash poor relative to the massive overhead required to maintain his status. When Pickford placed a massive certified cash offer on the table, it was an offer he literally could not afford to refuse. He needed the liquidity to fund the next chapter of his life, and she was the only entity willing and able to provide it instantaneously. When Douglas Fairbanks signed the deed transfer, relinquishing his ownership of Pickford, he did not just sign away a piece of property. He signed the instrument of his own abdication. He accepted a lump sum payment in exchange for the total surrender of his institutional authority, his social headquarters, and his historical legacy within the marriage. Pickford had successfully bought out the liability. She now owned the fortress entirely, free and clear of his encumbrances. The finalization of the divorce and the liquidation of the shared assets executed a structural severance that went far deeper than a legal decree of single status. Mary Pickford had provided Douglas Fairbanks with an invisible yet incredibly durable institutional shield for nearly 2 decades. In the ruthless, hyper-competitive ecosystem of Hollywood, Fairbanks's marriage to Pickford had granted him a level of immunity. Studio executives, independent financiers, and aggressive competitors hesitated to cross Fairbanks because doing so meant crossing Pickford and the massive retaliatory power of united artists. She was the stabilizing force that anchored his volatile, artisty, icy temperament to a foundation of corporate legitimacy. By finalizing the asset split on her strictly defined terms, Pickford systematically dismantled that shield. She withdrew her protection, leaving Fairbanks entirely exposed to the brutal market forces of an industry that no longer had a use for him. The execution of the settlement was chilling in its efficiency. There were no lingering joint accounts, no shared investment vehicles, and no ambiguous property lines. The empire was cleanly bifurcated. Pickford retained the operational control, the critical real estate, and the enduring brand equity. Fairbanks received a capital payout, a severance package that was mathematically fair, according to the ledgers, but strategically devastating to his long-term viability. He was legally processed out of the corporation. When the ink dried on the final settlement in 1936, the transition was absolute. He walked into the negotiation as the co-founder of an empire. He walked out as a wealthy but fundamentally unemployed independent contractor without a corporate home. Throughout the intense, high-stakes negotiations between Pickford's and Fairbanks's legal teams, Sylvia Ashley maintained a position of strategic, highly disciplined invisibility. She did not attempt to interject herself into the proceedings. She did not grant interviews to the press defending her position. She understood that any interference in the financial dissection of the Fairbanks-Pickford empire would only antagonize Pickford's lawyers and potentially jeopardize the capital payout that Fairbanks was negotiating to secure. Ashley was operating with the cold foresight of a wealth manager observing the restructuring of a primary asset. She recognized that her own future financial security was entirely dependent on the amount of liquid capital Fairbanks managed to extract from the divorce settlement. If he fought Pickford and was destroyed in court, Ashley's investment would be wiped out. Therefore, her role during the liquidation phase was strictly psychological maintenance. While Fairbanks endured the humiliating reality of being bought out and evicted by his wife, Ashley provided the critical emotional stabilization necessary to keep him functioning. She absorbed his rage, neutralized his panic, and continuously reinforced the illusion that he was trading a restrictive corporate marriage for a life of boundless freedom and aristocratic leisure with her. She was essentially managing his transition from a high-yield, active corporate asset into a fixed-income retirement fund. She knew his earning power in the film industry was permanently crippled. He was never going to generate the massive rolling revenue streams of the 1920s again. His wealth was now finite. The cash settlement he received from Pickford for his share of Pickfair and the other joint assets was the final major capital injection he would ever receive. Once the divorce was finalized and the capital was transferred into Fairbanks' sole possession, Ashley swiftly moved to lock down the asset. In March 1936, just months after the legal severance from Pickford, Sylvia Ashley and Douglas Fairbanks were married in Paris. This marriage was the culmination of Ashley's long-term investment strategy. By legally binding herself to Fairbanks immediately after his liquidation, she secured her position as the primary beneficiary of his remaining wealth. She had successfully navigated him through the treacherous waters of his divorce, ensuring he emerged with a substantial liquid severance package, and then legally positioned herself to manage and inherit that capital. She had converted the aging, obsolete king of Hollywood into her own highly secure private financial institution. For Douglas Fairbanks, the immediate aftermath of the financial settlement and his subsequent marriage to Sylvia Ashley was characterized by a profound, disorienting cognitive dissonance. The capital payout he received from Pickford allowed him to maintain the superficial trappings of his former status. He could still afford to charter yachts, reside in European luxury hotels, and purchase expensive tailored suits. He possessed the visuals of wealth, but he was entirely stripped of the mechanics of power. The reality of his liquidation became unavoidable when he attempted to re-engage with the social and professional hierarchies of Los Angeles. When Fairbanks returned to Hollywood as a single man, and later as the husband of Lady Ashley, he discovered that the geography of power had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer the host. He was merely a guest. The gates of Pickfair, the institution he had helped build and define, were permanently closed to him. Mary Pickford continued to reign over the estate, hosting the new generation of Hollywood power brokers, studio heads, and international dignitaries. She had seamlessly erased him from the architecture of the capital. Furthermore, his influence within United Artists was severely marginalized. While he still held foundational stock, the operational momentum of the company was driven by Pickford and the other active partners. He was treated with the polite, distant respect afforded to a retired founder, not the urgent deference demanded by an active executive. The industry had moved on. The machinery of Hollywood, which he once believed he controlled, continued to grind forward with terrifying efficiency, entirely indifferent to his absence. The psychological toll of this systemic rejection was devastating. Fairbanks had spent his entire adult life being observed, applauded, and obeyed. Now he was experiencing the absolute terror of irrelevance. He was a man without a country, a monarch who had sold his castle and found himself wandering the perimeter of his former kingdom. In a rare moment of unguarded, brutal honesty during his final years, Fairbanks summarized the absolute success of Mary Pickford's liquidation strategy. Stripped of his corporate shield and his physical headquarters and his professional relevance, he assessed his new standing in the world he had once conquered. "I feel like an exile," Fairbanks confessed. It was the ultimate tragic admission of defeat. He had sought validation in the arms of a younger woman, believing he was initiating a glorious second act. Instead, he had walked blindly into a highly calculated corporate restructuring. Mary Pickford had used her immense capital and emotional detachment to cleanly sever him from the empire, while Sylvia Ashley had used her strategic pragmatism to harvest the remaining yield of his wealth. The king had not been overthrown by a violent revolution. He had been quietly, efficiently, and legally liquidated by two women who understood the cold economics of survival far better than he ever did. As the 1930s drew to a close, the board was set for the final phase of this economic transaction. The fortress was secured, the acquisition was complete, and the depreciating asset was nearing its inevitable expiration date. The true efficacy of both the Pickford doctrine and the Ashley methodology would be proven not in the immediate aftermath of the divorce, but in the long-term survival of the women who designed them, and the ultimate total erasure of the man who thought he ruled them all. Following the finalization of the divorce and the execution of the financial settlement in 1936, the trajectory of Douglas Fairbanks transitioned from a gradual decline into a steep, irreversible freefall. Stripped of the institutional protection provided by Mary Pickford and the physical headquarters of Pickfair, Fairbanks was forced to navigate the global market as an independent entity. He quickly discovered that his personal brand, divorced from the corporate infrastructure that had sustained it, possessed very little standalone value in the new Hollywood economy. He attempted to initiate a professional resurgence by relocating his operational base to the United Kingdom. He met a production company, Fairbanks International, aiming to leverage his remaining European popularity and capitalize on the burgeoning British film industry. It was a desperate, highly flawed strategic maneuver. Fairbanks was attempting to replicate the success of United Artists without the foundational elements that made United Artists functional: a cartel of top-tier talent, an established distribution network, and, most critically, the ruthless administrative oversight of Mary Pickford. His efforts culminated in the 1936 film The Private Life of Don Juan. The production was an unmitigated disaster, serving as a brutal public confirmation of his obsolescence. The film was commercially unviable and critically panned. Audiences rejected the spectacle of an aging, visibly exhausted man attempting to perform the kinetic acrobatics of his youth. The failure of Don Juan was not merely a box office disappointment. It was a definitive market correction. It signaled to international financiers and studio distributors that Douglas Fairbanks was officially a toxic investment. his capacity to generate revenue was permanently extinguished. This professional termination accelerated his physical and psychological deterioration. Fairbanks had spent 3 decades operating under the assumption that his vitality was limitless. Now, operating in a state of continuous exile, his body began to systematically betray him. The relentless cardiovascular demands of his early career, combined with the heavy smoking and severe psychological stress of his professional irrelevance, triggered a rapid physiological decline. He began to suffer from severe angina, a direct biological consequence of the anxiety generated by his loss of status. He was trapped in a paradox of his own making. He possessed the liquid capital from the Pickford settlement to live a life of absolute leisure, but his psychological framework required the constant global validation of a working monarch. Denied that validity, he began to rapidly wither. The man who had once defined American physical supremacy was reduced to a fragile, increasingly paranoid retiree, wandering the golf courses of Europe and California, desperately trying to ignore the fact that the industry he helped create had seamlessly erased him from its ledgers. As Fairbanks entered this final phase of decline, Sylvia Ashley's role shifted from strategic opportunist to a highly disciplined guardian of his remaining wealth. She was legally bound to a man whose health was failing and whose primary source of income had completely evaporated. Ashley recognized that a dying, panicked man is a severe financial liability. If Fairbanks succumbed to his depression, he might engage in reckless spending, attempt to finance another disastrous film production to salvage his ego, or alter his estate planning in a moment of erratic volatility. To mitigate these risks, Ashley implemented a policy of absolute environmental control. She effectively quarantined Fairbanks within a bubble of meticulously curated luxury. She managed his social calendar, limiting his interactions with industry executives who might remind him of his lost power or pitch him high-risk investment schemes. She curated his environment to reflect a state of perpetual aristocratic calm, insulating him from the harsh realities of the Hollywood market. She transitioned him away from the aggressive physical lifestyle he could no longer sustain and integrated him into the sedentary, highly structured routines of the European upper class. Ashley's management was neither malicious nor explicitly cruel. It was ruthlessly pragmatic. She provided the highest standard of care, ensuring he had access to elite medical specialists and constant, soothing companionship. She performed the duties of a devoted wife with flawless precision. However, every action was calibrated to maintain his psychological stability, and by extension, the stability of the portfolio she was destined to inherit. She understood that her yield depended entirely on preventing the asset from self-destructing before the natural expiration of the contract. She monitored his expenditures, subtly steering him away from the massive, impulsive purchases that had defined his earlier years. She ensured that the capital he had extracted from the Pickford liquidation remained largely intact, invested in secure, low-risk vehicles rather than the highly volatile entertainment ventures he previously favored. Sylvia Ashley was essentially running out the clock. She had successfully captured the billionaire. Her final task was to manage the decline of his biological infrastructure while securing her position as the primary beneficiary of his estate. While Fairbanks and Ashley navigated the grim realities of his physical and professional decay, Mary Pickford was operating at the absolute peak of her executive efficiency. The liquidation of Fairbanks had structurally purified her empire. Unburdened by his erratic behavior and the constant threat of a public morality scandal, she focused her formidable intellect on consolidating her monopoly within United Artists and expanding her personal investment portfolio. The late 1930s were a period of intense boardroom warfare at United Artists. With Fairbanks effectively neutralized as a voting bloc and D.W. Griffith having previously sold his shares, the power dynamic within the corporation shifted. Pickford found herself frequently clashing with Charlie Chaplin and the newly integrated independent producers like Samuel Goldwyn and Alexander Korda. In these negotiations, Pickford deployed the exact same cold mathematical ruthlessness she had utilized during her divorce. She utilized her massive cash reserves to buy out dissenting partners, finance internal infrastructure, and dictate distribution terms. When Goldwyn attempted to challenge her authority, she did not engage in emotional disputes. She leveraged her equity to block his initiative, thus eventually forcing him into a protracted legal battle that ended with his departure from the company. Pickford proved that her capacity for corporate dominance was entirely independent of her former husband. She was a lethal operator in the boardroom, utilizing the capital she had protected during the divorce to wage war on her corporate rivals. Simultaneously, Pickford executed a brilliant strategic maneuver in her personal life to permanently insulate herself from the vulnerabilities that had plagued her marriage to Fairbanks. In 1937, she married Charles Buddy Rogers. Rogers was an actor and a band leader, 12 years her junior. However, the significance of this marriage lay in the fundamental power dynamic it established. Unlike Douglas Fairbanks, who possessed a massive, fragile ego and demanded to be treated as an equal sovereign, Buddy Rogers was entirely compliant. He lacked the staggering global fame, the massive independent wealth, and the domineering personality of his predecessor. Pickford did not marry Rogers to merge empires. She acquired him as a safe, highly manageable domestic asset. Rogers posed absolutely no threat to her corporate authority. He did not challenge her decisions in the boardroom, nor did he threaten to destabilize her public image with reckless international affairs. He was a handsome, agreeable companion who provided the social utility of a husband without the structural liabilities of a competitor. By marrying Rogers, Pickford achieved the ultimate objective of the female industrialist in a patriarchal system. She secured the societal respectability of marriage while retaining absolute, unmitigated control over her capital, her real estate, and her corporate autonomy. She had successfully replaced a highly volatile, depreciating asset with a low-risk, easily managed utility, ensuring that her fortress remained impenetrable. The inevitable conclusion to Douglas Fairbanks's physical decline arrived with brutal, unsentimental sudden. A massive fatal heart attack silenced the fallen king of the silent screen. The global press published eulogies praising his athletic prowess and foundational role in Hollywood mythology, while the public mourned the cinematic pioneer. However, stripped of the romanticized media narrative, the reality of his death was a cold clinical economic event. Fairbanks did not die a powerful man. He died in exile in his own city, a retired partner who had outlived his professional utility. The heart attack was simply the final physiological termination of a contract that had been socially and professionally voided years earlier. The immediate aftermath of his death clearly illustrated the absolute success of the strategies employed by the two women who had managed his decline. When the news of Fairbanks's passing was delivered to Pickfair, Mary Pickford maintained her strict, unyielding composure. She did not issue a hysterical statement to the press, nor did she attempt to hijack the narrative of his death to center herself as the grieving original wife. She released a brief, highly formal statement of condolence, perfectly calibrated to project respect without conceding an ounce of emotional vulnerability. Pickford recognized that to mourn him too loudly was to re-entangle herself with a liability she had paid a fortune to liquidate. She had already processed his departure from her life 3 years prior during the financial settlement. His biological death was merely a footnote to the corporate severance. She remained secure in the fortress of Pickford, her wealth untouched, her brand pristine, and her corporate power unchallenged by his passing. For Sylvia Ashley, the death of Douglas Fairbanks was the triggering event for the realization of her long-term investment strategy. The venture capital play had reached its maturity date. The careful, disciplined management she had executed over the preceding years, isolating him from outside influence, managing his decline, and ensuring her legal status as his wife, was about to yield a massive dividend. When Fairbanks's last will and testament was executed, the financial reality of Ashley's triumph was made public. Fairbanks left an estate valued at roughly $2 million, a staggering sum at the end of the Great Depression. After the disbursement of specific trusts to his son and various family members, Sylvia Ashley inherited the bulk of his liquid capital, receiving an outright payout of approximately $1 million. The magnitude of this victory becomes painfully clear when looking at the mathematics of the era. In 1939, $1 million possessed the purchasing power of roughly $22 million in contemporary currency. It was a sum that guaranteed absolute lifelong financial autonomy. Sylvia Ashley, a woman born into a working-class family in Paddington with no access to higher education, institutional support, or independent wealth creation mechanisms, had successfully navigated the most ruthless economic hierarchy on the planet. She had identified a vulnerability in the power structure of Hollywood, bypassed the reigning queen of the industry, acquired the most famous actor in the world, and legally extracted a massive fortune. She did not achieve this through luck or romantic destiny. She achieved it through the flawless execution of a high-risk, high-yield wealth transfer strategy. She had provided Fairbanks with the illusion of control, allowing him to die believing he was still a desired virile king, while she systematically secured the legal right to his treasury. Upon receiving her inheritance, Ashley did not retreat into obscurity. She had acquired the capital necessary to operate entirely on her own terms. She maintained her title, her global mobility, and her access to the international elite. She had converted the tragedy of a fading actor into her own permanent financial emancipation. She was no longer a woman dependent on the favor of wealthy men. She was a highly capitalized and dependent entity, fully equipped to dominate the next phase of her life. The board had been completely cleared. The king was dead. His wealth had been redistributed, and the two women who had engineered the outcome stood entirely undefeated. The death of Douglas Fairbanks did not mark the conclusion of these economic maneuvers. It signified the closing of a highly profitable fiscal quarter. The ensuing decades proved the ultimate efficacy of both women's survival strategies. Mary Pickford directed her executive focus toward the absolute monopolization of her legacy. As television emerged in the 1950s, studios aggressively sold their back catalogs for cheap broadcast rights. Pickford flatly refused. Retaining total ownership of her physical negatives, She enacted a strict embargo, locking her films in vaults. She understood that commodifying her legacy on low-fidelity television would dilute her premium branding. By artificially restricting supply, she ensured her image remained a rare, highly coveted asset. In 1976, she accepted an honorary Oscar via a pre-recorded broadcast from her living room. She forced the industry to come to her, secure inside the fortress she owned outright. Simultaneously, Sylvia Ashley deployed the Fairbanks inheritance to expand her venture capital operations globally. She recognized that liquid capital requires continuous reinvestment. She systematically acquired and liquidated a series of high-net-worth targets. She married and divorced a British lord, and in 1949 executed her most audacious acquisition by marrying Clark Gable, the undisputed king of Hollywood. When that merger collapsed, she negotiated a highly lucrative divorce settlement, extracting massive capital from the biggest star in the world before marrying a prince in 1954. She walked away as a fabulously wealthy, independent operator who systematically converted the vulnerabilities of powerful men into her own permanent security. Mary Pickford and Sylvia Ashley definitively proved that in the golden age of Hollywood, a woman could survive the most devastating betrayals and conquer the industry by maintaining a sub-zero emotional temperature and treating every human interaction as a highly calculated corporate transaction. They survived because they never allowed passion to override pragmatism. They used the cold logic of capitalism to secure their thrones and liquidate the men who attempted to compromise them. The strategic triumphs of Mary Pickford and Sylvia Ashley proved that survival in Golden Age Hollywood demanded a sub-zero emotional temperature. But what happens when a global icon chooses the exact opposite strategy? The catastrophic collision between Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini would soon test whether absolute romantic autonomy could survive a highly coordinated character assassination, an affair so intensely passionate, so publicly brazen, and so politically explosive that it transcended Hollywood gossip and triggered a formal intervention on the floor of the United States Senate. We explore how the American media and political establishment, terrified by a woman who chose romantic autonomy over corporate compliance, conspired to execute a global, highly coordinated character assassination. Was Ingrid Bergman a naive victim of her own destructive desires, or was she the ultimate rebel, willing to burn her own empire to the ground simply to prove she was alive? Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to ensure you do not miss the dissection of Hollywood's most dangerous international scandal. And tell us in the comments below, when it comes to surviving a brutal betrayal, who was the superior strategist, Mary Pickford, who bought out the kingdom, or Sylvia Ashley, who cashed out the king